There's something almost unsettling about standing beneath the timbers of a medieval house that still breathes after 5 or 6 centuries. Unsettling, because it forces you to wonder just how much the world truly changes when the bones of old buildings outlast the people who built them. You can sense it when you run your hand across an ancient beam, the surface polished by the brush of countless fingers, the grain worn by the passage of time and smoke from countless hearts. It is here, hidden in these stubborn structures, that the story of medieval craftsmanship unfolds. A story, not just of wood and stone, but of a mentality that fused necessity with ingenuity and superstition with science. These homes did not spring up overnight. They rose from the patient toil of master craftsmen, men who began as apprentices, boys of 12 or 13, hands raw from splinters, learning to read with the way a monk reads scripture. For 7 years or more, they watched and waited, absorbing the secrets of seasoned carpenters who measured without rulers but with cords knotted at precise intervals, who checked plumb with weighted strings, and the uncanny sense that came from doing the same task 1,000 times. No blueprints, no mechanical saws, just knowledge passed mouth to ear, from calloused hand to eager one. The true genius was in their approach to wood. They understood that green, unseasoned oak would shrink as it dried, tightening every joint like sinew binding bone. They shaped massive beams with axes and ADSs, fitting each mortise and tenon with the precision of a clockmaker, though clocks themselves were still an exotic luxury for cathedrals, not cottage walls. These frames were assembled on the ground, each beam marked with runes or numerals, so that when the day came to raise the house, every piece knew its place. Imagine the scene, an entire community gathered to lift the bones of a new home into place. Men heaving on ropes, voices hoarse with the strain, women and children watching from the muddy lanes, the crash of hammer on peg, the creak as the frame took its shape against the sky. It was more than construction, it was a ritual, binding families to earth and neighborhood, forging an unwritten promise that these timbers would stand guard long after their builders were gone. Yet even the strongest frame was just the skeleton. Flesh came in the form of wattle and daub, willow or hazel branches, woven like a basket, then smeared with a pungent paste of clay, straw, animal hair, and manure. This simple skin, so humble, by today's standards, held warmth against bitter winds, and, when patched and cared for, could endure for generations. Lime wash, slaked from burned limestone, brightened the walls, its white glare bouncing what little sunlight filtered through. Oiled parchment or thin slices of horn where glass was too dear to use. Inside, every inch had a purpose. The ground floor, opening directly onto the street, was both a shop and a defense, a place to earn coin, to display wares, to keep an eye on the shifting tides of trade and rumor. Behind the shop front lay the hearth, where meals bubbled in a single pot that could cost as much as a small flock of sheep. Smoke snaked upward through the rafters, staining the beams, chasing out insects, preserving the wood from rot. It filled lungs and eyes alike, but the blackened timbers are part of what let so many buildings survive when lesser ones crumbled. Above, the living quarters pressed close under pitched roofs, each floor jutting a foot or two farther out than the one below. This clever trick, the jetty, gave extra space where land was taxed by footprint, and it sheltered passersby. From rain, windows might be shuttered tight or left ajar to catch the drift of a rare breeze, but they offered little privacy. Tapestries, more precious than furniture, hung not just for decoration but to trap heat and dampen the relentless cold. Beds were built into alcoves or tucked into corners, raised off the ground and filled with straw, freshened each season if you were fortunate. Whole families slept side by side, wrapped in blankets of coarse wool, each breath mingling with the draft that whistled through poorly sealed eaves. Furniture was sparse and stout. Heavy oak tables doubled as workbenches and dining spots. Chests stored linens by day and served as benches by night. Iron nails were costly, so pegs and clever joinery did the work instead. Every item had a story, a pot passed down for generations, a carved chest bearing a family's crest, a hammer that built not just one house but a dozen in the same street. These were not possessions in the modern sense. They were heirlooms, the physical memory of labor, trade, and kinship, while the middle class of merchants and craftsmen built their timbered houses with skill and resourcefulness. The nobility carved their ambitions into stone. Castles rose on promontories, their towers visible for miles, monuments to wealth and a grim deterrent to rebellion. The techniques here were different, but the principle was the same. Build not just for your lifetime, but for the dynasty you hope will follow. Walls up to 10 feet thick, filled with rubble and mortar between perfectly dressed stones, stood ready to defy siege weapons and the slow crawl of erosion alike. Chimneys, still novel, drew smoke away efficiently, a luxury the peasant or craftsman could barely imagine. Inside these fortresses, tapestries lined the walls to muffle the cold, while floors of thick planks or flagstones echoed with the footfalls of servants, knights, and visiting dignitaries. The great hall, with its soaring beams, was both courtroom and dining room, its hearth large enough to roast whole beasts on feast days. Servants bustled between kitchens, often built in separate wings to minimize fire risks, and storage cellars stocked with barrels of wine and salted meats. Bedrooms, when they existed, were cavernous chambers, their beds draped with heavy curtains to create islands of warmth in the winter chill. Yet, for all the opulence, even these stone giants needed constant care. Masons repaired crumbling mortar, thatchers climbed high roofs to replace weather-worn tiles, carpenters braced sagging beams. Each repair was a line in the long-living script of the building's life, a record as clear as any parish roll or royal decree. Outside the castles and manor houses, the poorest lived in shadows, both literal and social. A peasant's hut, cobbled together with bent timbers and thatched with whatever straw could be gleaned, might stand for a generation if fortune and weather were kind. When it fell, it rotted back into the fields, taking with it the stories of those who once huddled inside. Few of these homes survived, yet their absence speaks volumes, a ghostly chorus that reminds us that the grand houses we admire were always just one part of a larger, harsher reality. The bones of medieval cities endure because they were built with an understanding we have half forgotten, that a dwelling is not just shelter but a pact, a promise that, with enough care, it might cradle the lives of your children's children. Timber ages and creaks, stone weathers and crumbles, but the idea holds steady. Craft well, build wisely, and your story might yet echo in the beams long after your name fades from memory. Walk these streets today, and you're not just witnessing architecture. You're touching the very heart of an age when survival depended on skill, community, and the hope that what you built might outlast you. And somehow, centuries later, here they stand, leaning, cracked, yet defiantly alive, beneath the ancient roofs that still cling to crooked alleys and market squares. Another layer of truth lies buried, one that reaches beyond timber and stone, and deeper still into the murky crossroads where medieval craft met something far older, far stranger. Because while the masons and carpenters labored by day, shaping cathedrals and homes to defy the centuries, a quieter force moved beneath the mortars, the forgotten texts, the coded symbols, the half-suppressed currents of knowledge that flowed through Europe like an underground river. Think of the abbeys perched on lonely hills, their libraries lit by beeswax candles, where robed monks turned delicate pages of manuscripts older than their own mother tongues. Much of what they copied was scripture, yet tucked among the Psalms, and Gospels were fragments of Roman engineering, Greek geometry, even remnants of Hermetic lore carried westward by traders, pilgrims, or fugitives of war. In these scriptoriums, ideas too dangerous for the pulpit were kept alive in the margins, inked in tiny notes that revealed methods for surveying land, harnessing water, or raising arches so high they seemed to lift the soul itself toward heaven. It was in these margins that the DNA of medieval innovation lay hidden. What we now call lost was never truly lost, merely cloaked in the veils of secrecy, protected by men and women who knew that knowledge was power, and power demanded guardianship. Some of these keepers of forgotten wisdom belonged to monastic orders. Others drifted at the edges of orthodoxy, accused of heresy, witchcraft, or alchemy. They left signs etched into foundation stones, geometric puzzles carved into cathedral doorways, and stained glass windows whose patterns echoed ancient truths, symbols meant to outlive any single mind. If you stand in the nave of an old cathedral and look up, you can feel it, a blueprint of the cosmos encoded in ribbed vaults and pointed arches. Medieval builders understood the secret language of proportion, the ratios drawn from the movements of stars, the angles that mirrored the petals of a flower or the spiral of a shell. To them, a building was not just a shelter but a vessel for divine geometry, a sacred alignment between earth and sky. And so, these structures remain, resonating with a quiet harmony we can sense, even if we've forgotten how to read its notes. Outside the cathedral walls, in bustling city streets, another kind of code was at work. Merchants marked their timber beams with masons' marks and runes, not merely to identify pieces, but to weave a protective spell of prosperity and survival. A single crooked beam might bear dozens of overlapping signs, astrological glyphs, stylized animals, crosses within circles, a reminder that every house was more than walls and roof. It was an amulet, a pact between the builder, the materials, and the unseen forces that shaped fate. And what of the castles that still brood on lonely hilltops, beneath their stone ramparts? Some chambers were more than storehouses for grain or weapons. Subterranean passages, echoing with the drip of groundwater, connected chapels to secret crypts, alchemists' workshops, and hidden libraries that no invading army could ever loot entirely. It was said that in times of siege, these vaults protected more than gold. They shielded scrolls and ciphered texts that preserved the lifeblood of ancient thought. Some whispered that these repositories kept records of technologies older than Christendom itself. Remnants of Roman aqueduct schematics, or even stranger treatises whose origins remain clouded by rumor. Does this sound like fantasy? Consider the real discoveries that still baffle us, the sophisticated water mills that powered entire monasteries centuries before modern turbines. The complex clockworks hidden in cathedral towers that kept astonishingly precise time long before the first wristwatch ticked to life. The undercroft passages lined with runic inscriptions so old no one can translate them fully. Each clue is a thread back to a world where engineering and esoterica danced together, where building a house, a fortress, or a cathedral was an act of practical survival and metaphysical defiance all at once. And woven through all of this is the enduring mystery of human memory. For every manuscript that survived flame and flood, 100 more dissolved into dust or lay buried in the walls themselves, hidden behind plaster and wainscot. Even today, when restorers peel back the centuries, they sometimes find scraps of parchment tucked inside beams, charms for protection, or prayers to guard against ruin. We see them now as quaint superstitions, yet they speak to something deeper, an understanding that what we build shelters not only our bodies but our beliefs, our stories, our fleeting hopes for immortality. It is easy, in our age of reinforced concrete and digital blueprints, to imagine that we have surpassed those who came before. We mock their primitive tools, their open hearths and crooked walls. Yet the proof of their wisdom stands all around us, where our glass towers falter and crumble under winds they never foresaw. Their houses, built from local wood and bone-aching labor, lean but do not fall. Their castles, battered by cannon fire and centuries of rain, still cast their shadows. On the valleys below, perhaps this is the final, unspoken secret of medieval builders, that every structure was a dialogue with time. They did not dream of eternal youth for their works. They dreamed of graceful aging, of a slow surrender to the seasons that would feed the next generation's hands with lessons written in timber and stone. They accepted what we resist, that all things are temporary. Yet none is ever truly lost if its essence is remembered and reborn. So when you stand in the hush of an old European street, when your hand brushes the cold wall of a house that sheltered merchants or monks or peasants 700 winters ago, listen. Listen for the creak of the beams, the echo of chisels. Long stilled, the murmur of secrets half sung to the dark. What you hear is not just history, it is a blueprint for a different kind of future, one rooted in humility and wonder, in craft and care, and the patient art of enduring, and maybe, just maybe, that is the greatest medieval discovery of all, that the strength of a home, a city, or a civilization lies not in how high it can rise, but in how deeply it remembers what holds it together when storms come, not steel or stone alone, but the human soul, bound to the earth and sky by the things it dares to build, and the mysteries it chooses to keep. When you walk through the narrow streets of old European towns, you might pass buildings that have been standing since the Middle Ages. It's mind-blowing to think that some of these houses have survived wars, fires, storms, and centuries of use, all without the benefit of modern construction technology. But to truly understand how medieval builders created structures so durable that we can still visit them today, you first have to look at the lives lived inside these walls. Because what was built and how well it endured depended entirely on who you were in this rigid world that stacked people like stones in a fortress wall. In this age, medieval society was a pyramid, an edifice of power and poverty bound together by faith, fear, and obligation. At the very top sat the kings and queens, sovereigns who'd won life's lottery by birthright alone. These rulers, draped in ermine and velvet, made decisions that rippled across thousands of miles. With a single decree they could summon an army, levy a tax, or send a traitor to the block. They lived in stone fortresses, built to resist not just time, but the endless ambitions of rivals. Their castles loomed over the countryside, reminders that power was never truly yours. It was borrowed from the gods, the people, and fate. Below, the royal families were the nobles' landowners who governed vast estates and commanded legions of servants. They filled their days with feasts in echoing great halls, hunts through ancient forests, and occasional campaigns alongside their king. For these nobles, stone was more than a material, it was a declaration. Their manor houses were miniature castles, walls thick enough to swallow the sound of plots and betrayals whispered inside. These walls might hide a treasury of gold coins, bolts of imported silk, or a secret passageway to flee when a feud turned bloody. Yet the heart of medieval cities did not beat in these fortresses. It pulsed in the narrow streets, crowded with merchants, guildsmen, and craftsmen, the precarious middle class, whose skills and ambition built entire neighborhoods. These were the men and women who could turn sheep's wool into a tapestry, iron ore into a sword, oak timber into the half-timber bird houses that still lean over cobblestone lanes. Their homes were marvels of ingenuity, timber frames fitted together with mortise and tenon joints so precise that each beam locked the whole into place. The spaces between were packed with wattle and daub branches, mud, straw, and animal hair woven into walls that breathed with the seasons yet held back wind and rain. If you were lucky enough to own such a home, you were also part of the engine that made medieval life run. Your ground floor was your workshop, open to the street, where apprentices hammered, shoed horses, or sold pies fresh from the oven. Above, the family lived and slept, warmth rising from the hearth, smoke drifting out through a thatched or tiled roof. Privacy was a notion for the future. Tapestries hung from beams to divide space, but voices carried. Babies were born beside the embers of last night's fire. Daughters were betrothed in the same room where barrels of salted fish were stored for winter. A single building could hold a dynasty's entire story, each beam absorbing secrets like a sponge. Further down the pyramid were the peasants, the lifeblood and burden-bearers of medieval Europe. They farmed the land dawn to dusk, turning soil for harvests that might feed them, but mostly fed their lords. Some were free, able to pack up and seek a kindermaster if they could risk the wrath of the landowner they left behind. Others were serfs, bound to the earth by contracts inked generations before they were born. Their houses were simple, crook-frame, huts bent timbers forming an A-frame, walls packed with clay, straw, and the byproducts of livestock. Inside, humans and animals often shared the same breath, cows penned in the corner for warmth. Children curled on straw pallets by the hearth. These dwellings sank back into the earth within decades, absorbed by the fields they stood upon. Above all of them loomed the church, the ultimate landlord of souls. Cathedrals rose like fossilized prayers, spires pointing a finger at heaven, as if to remind every soul below that this life was only a vestibule to eternity. Monasteries preserved the knowledge of ages, copying ancient texts illuminated with gold leaf and mystery. For a clever peasant boy, the church offered a rare ladder. Out of the mud, if he learned to read Latin, to chant the Psalms, he might rise from plow to pulpit, trading backbreaking labor for a scholar's pen. It was a gamble against the iron weight of the feudal contract, and few won it. Wander through a medieval city today, and the remnants of this hierarchy still echo in stone and timber. Streets coil like a snail's shell around a core of power, the castle or cathedral, then spiral outward through merchant quarters into the hovels and shacks pressed against the city walls. These walls, up to 30 feet high and 12 feet thick, were the last defense against raiders, plague, or rebellion. Gates slammed shut at sunset. Miss curfew, and you'd plead with guards to lift the portcullis before wolves or worse found you in the dark. Inside these walls, life was as crowded as it was precarious. Tanneries reeked of animal hides, soaked in urine and lime. Blacksmiths' hammers rang out from dawn till dusk. Bakers rose before the sun to stoke communal ovens that would feed half a neighborhood. Streets doubled as marketplaces, latrines, gossip channels, and parade routes for whatever festival or royal visit might roll through. Narrow lanes turned into rivers of filth when it rained, washing waste toward the moat, which was, more often than not, a breeding ground for pestilence. And yet, despite all this, people built their lives here, generation after generation, braving the fires that leaped from thatch to thatch, the outbreaks of plague that could empty entire quarters in weeks. The genius of these cities lay in their adaptability. Roman roads still slashed through them, straight and defiant against the tangle of medieval streets that grew wherever foot traffic wore a trail. Trade routes brought wealth and disease in equal measure, but they also carried ideas, new ways to measure wood, to fire bricks, to carve stone. As houses leaned and creaked with age, families repaired them with whatever they had. Fresh timber stolen from royal forests, tiles scavenged from ruins, wattle daubed thicker with each generation's manure. Standing inside one of these ancient homes today, you might feel the boards shift beneath your feet. You might run your palm along an oak beam that sprouted when the Black Death still haunted the land. You'd see carpenter's marks, clever joinery, pegs driven by hands long turned to dust. These weren't just dwellings, they were the physical record of centuries of survival, of families who huddled together through storms that rattled shutters and flames that devoured entire burrows. What survives reminds us that these people knew something we often forget, that a house is not just a roof overhead. It's a promise to the future, a hope that long after you're gone, your story might be read in the beams, the stones, the layers of soot that gather in the hearth's throat. And so, as you stand in the shadow of these medieval walls, listening to the wind whistle through a crooked frame, you're not just looking at history, you're standing inside it.